You won't believe what happened. A horse covered in oil showed up by the riverbank. No one wanted to help. But then, an old lady kneels down and does something no one expected. And the ending will touch your heart. Subscribe now for more life-changing stories. It was one of those oppressive early fall afternoons in Riverdale, a small town in rural Kentucky, where time seemed to move as slowly as the Blackwater River that cut through pastures and weathered farmlands. The water flowed serenely, mirroring the unchanging rhythm of life that had defined the community for generations. Most residents had settled into the comfortable predictability of their existence, until that particular Tuesday when everything changed. Margaret Cooper was hanging laundry in her backyard when she first noticed the unusual commotion down by the riverbank. At 62, she had lived alone in her modest white cottage since her husband Thomas passed away 5 years ago. She maintained a small vegetable garden behind her house and rarely participated in town gatherings or the farmers' market chatter. The townspeople had grown accustomed to her reserved nature, respecting her grief without fully understanding it. Setting down her wicker basket, Margaret shielded her eyes from the afternoon sun and squinted toward the river. A dark shape disrupted the familiar landscape, and a small crowd was gathering around it. Curiosity pulled at her, something she hadn't felt in years. "What's happening down there?" she called to her neighbor, Judy Thompson, who was hurrying past her fence. "Something's washed up by Miller's Bend," Judy replied breathlessly. "Some kind of animal. People are saying it might be dangerous." Margaret hesitated, her hands instinctively gripping the wooden fence. The last time she had ventured near that part of the river was the spring of 1987, a memory she had carefully packed away. But something about this disruption, this break in routine, compelled her forward. "I'll come with you," she said quietly, surprising herself as much as Judy. By the time they reached the riverbank, at least 20 residents had formed a loose semicircle around what was now clearly visible. A large horse, its body partially covered in what looked like thick black oil. The animal lay motionless on the smooth river stones, its ribcage visibly pronounced, nostrils flaring with labored breath. With each attempt to stand, its trembling legs buckled, driving its chest back onto the hard stones. "Don't get too close," warned Sheriff Jack Davis, keeping a cautious distance himself. "No telling where it came from or what condition it's in." The pungent smell of crude oil hung in the air, making several onlookers cover their noses with handkerchiefs or sleeves. The horse's mane was matted with the thick substance, obscuring its eyes and much of its face. 10-year-old Billy Harmon pointed from behind his mother's protective arm. "What if it bites, Sheriff?" "It looks sick," said Eleanor White, the town's librarian, noticing the dark foam dripping from the horse's nostrils. "Perhaps we should call Dr. Reynolds." "The veterinarian is out of town until Thursday," replied Frank Miller, whose family had owned the adjacent land for generations. "Besides, it might not make it that long anyway." The crowd murmured, theories spreading from person to person. Someone mentioned the old Hartman Oil Company that had shut down upstream years ago. Another suggested the horse might have escaped from a traveling carnival. But as minutes stretched on, the initial curiosity began giving way to discomfort and then indifference. Slowly, people started to disperse, retreating to the comfort of their ordinary lives. "There's nothing we can do," Frank concluded, turning away. "Nature will take its course." Margaret had remained at the edge of the gathering, watching silently. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as memories she had long suppressed began to surface. The retreating figures of her neighbors created a widening space around the suffering animal, and something deep inside her shifted. Without announcing her intentions, she moved forward, her worn boots crunching against the river stones. Several people turned, startled by her approach. "Margaret, don't go near it," called Sheriff Davis. "We don't know if it's safe." But Margaret continued, her movements deliberate and careful. She knelt in the damp earth several feet from the horse, her arthritic knees protesting as she lowered herself to the ground. The animal's labored breathing seemed to synchronize with the gentle lapping of the river against the shore. A hush fell over the remaining onlookers as Margaret extended a weathered hand toward the horse's oil-slicked muzzle. The animal didn't flinch or resist. Instead, its neck drooped slightly to one side, making contact with her outstretched palm as if recognizing something familiar in her touch. From her pocket, Margaret withdrew a white handkerchief, one of Thomas's that she still carried out of habit. Without hesitation, she began to wipe the thick oil from the horse's face, using gentle circular motions. The pristine fabric quickly turned black, but she continued working methodically and with surprising tenderness. Beneath the sticky layer of crude, patches of light chestnut coat began to emerge. As she cleaned around the animal's front leg, something caught her attention. A small, heart-shaped marking partially obscured by mud and oil. Her hand froze, mid-motion, and those close enough could see her eyes widen with recognition, then fill with tears. She traced the marking with trembling fingers, as if confirming what her heart already knew. "Impossible," she whispered, the word carried away by the afternoon breeze. For 20 years, Margaret Cooper had raised horses alongside her husband. Their pride had been a chestnut stallion born on their small ranch, distinguished by a heart-shaped marking that Thomas had lovingly called nature's signature. That horse had disappeared during the Great Flood of 1997, presumed carried away by the raging waters despite weeks of searching. The loss had broken something in Margaret, leading her to sell their remaining horses and retreat into solitude after Thomas's passing. Jackson Reed, a young mechanic who'd been observing from the sidelines, was the first to break the spell. Without a word, he jogged back toward town, returning minutes later with a bucket of clean water. Eleanor White hurried home and came back with several old towels. Slowly, others who had started to leave returned, forming a circle of unexpected support. "What can we do to help, Margaret?" asked Sheriff Davis, kneeling beside her, his earlier caution replaced by determination. For the first time in years, Margaret looked up at her neighbors with purpose in her eyes. "We need to get this oil off him before it poisons him further. And he'll need shelter, food." What had begun as collective hesitation transformed into communal action. Someone brought a tarp to create shade from the afternoon sun. Frank Miller, who had been ready to walk away minutes earlier, offered his pickup truck to transport the horse once it was stable enough to move. Dr. Lewis, the town physician, arrived with medical supplies that might be adapted for the animal's immediate needs. As the afternoon wore on, the horse began showing signs of improvement. With support, it managed to stand shakily, its eyes, no visible after careful cleaning, showing a flicker of life. The residents of Riverdale worked together, passing buckets of water, taking turns gently cleansing the animal's coat, and speaking in soothing tones. "Do you really think it could be the same horse after all these years?" Judy asked Margaret quietly as they applied a salve Dr. Lewis had provided. Margaret ran her fingers over the heart-shaped marking again, now fully visible against the clean chestnut coat. "I don't know how it's possible," she admitted, "but I'd recognize this mark anywhere. This is Phoenix." The name hung in the air. Phoenix, the horse that had vanished 2 decades ago, seemingly returned from the impossible. As twilight settled over Riverdale, transforming the river into ribbons of gold and purple, the residents found themselves bound together by something unexpected, a collective purpose born from one woman's refusal to turn away. Sheriff Davis approached Margaret as she sat beside the now resting horse. "We've arranged for Phoenix to stay in the old Miller barn tonight. It's not much, but it's dry and safe until we figure out a better solution tomorrow." Margaret nodded gratefully, her hand not leaving the horse's neck. "I'll stay with him," she said simply. "You don't have to do this alone, Margaret," Sheriff Davis replied, his voice gentle. "Not anymore. As stars appeared above Riverdale, the transformation that had taken place went beyond the rescue of a mysterious horse. The townspeople, who had lived alongside one another for years without truly connecting, found themselves sharing coffee from thermoses, exchanging stories, and making plans for tomorrow. Margaret Cooper, who had been invisible to many of them for so long, now sat at the center of their circle, quietly stroking Phoenix's mane as he dozed fitfully. None of them could have predicted how this single afternoon would ripple through their community in the days to come, or how the appearance of one oil-covered horse would begin to wash away the barriers they had built between one another over the years. Word of the mysterious horse's appearance spread through Riverdale like wildfire. By sunrise the following day, the old Miller barn had become an impromptu gathering place. Townspeople arrived with offerings, freshly cut hay from the Anderson farm, oats from the general store, and specially mixed feed from those who still kept horses. Margaret had spent the night on a makeshift cot beside Phoenix, refusing to leave his side despite multiple offers to take her place. "You look exhausted, Margaret," said Eleanor White, arriving with a thermos of coffee and homemade biscuits. "You should go home and get some proper rest." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully, but shook her head. "I'm afraid if I leave, this will all turn out to be a dream," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She ran her fingers along Phoenix's flank, now mostly cleaned of oil, though still bearing dark stains in places. "I still can't believe he's here." The Miller barn, unused for years since Frank's father had sold off their livestock, now hummed with activity. Jackson Reed, the young mechanic, had rigged up a temporary water trough and was examining the barn's structure for weak spots that might need repair. Sheriff Davis had contacted Dr. Reynolds, the veterinarian, who promised to return to town a day early to examine the horse. "How old would this horse be now if it's really the one you lost?" asked Judy, sitting on an overturned bucket beside Margaret. 25, maybe 26, Margaret replied, calculating the years in her head. "Thomas and I bred his mother ourselves. He was born in the spring of '92. That's old for a horse, isn't it?" Judy seemed skeptical. "And to survive all these years on his own, through who knows what conditions." Margaret nodded, understanding the doubt. "It does seem impossible," she conceded. "But that marking, Thomas always said there wasn't another like it in the world." Phoenix stirred, adjusting his position on the fresh bedding the Miller boys had spread that morning. Though still weak, his eyes were clearer, and he had managed to eat a small amount of the offered feed. The dark foam that had worried everyone the previous day was gone, replaced by normal breathing. Whatever toxins the oil had contained were working their way out of his system. Around mid-morning, a sleek silver SUV pulled up outside the barn, drawing curious glances from the gathered townspeople. The vehicle was distinctly out of place among the weathered pickup trucks and practical sedans that typically populated Riverdale. A tall man in his 50s, dressed in pressed khakis and a button-down shirt that seemed too formal for their rural setting, stepped out and approached the barn. His confident stride and city attire immediately marked him as an outsider. "I'm looking for whoever's in charge here," he announced, scanning the faces before him. "My name is Richard Prescott. I'm from Lexington." Sheriff Davis stepped forward, extending his hand. "Jack Davis, Riverdale Sheriff. What brings you to our town, Mr. Prescott?" Richard's gaze moved past the sheriff to the horse lying in the straw. "I heard about a horse that was found covered in oil. News travels fast in these parts." He pulled out his phone and showed a news article with a blurry photo someone had taken the previous day and apparently shared online. "I have reason to believe this animal might belong to me." A murmur passed through the gathered residents, and Margaret slowly rose to her feet, her hands still resting protectively on Phoenix's neck. "This horse was found on our riverbank," Sheriff Davis replied, carefully, "and we have reason to believe it might belong to one of our residents." Richard's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened slightly. I understand the confusion, Sheriff. I own Prescott Stables outside of Lexington. About 3 months ago, one of my most valuable breeding stallions escaped during a thunderstorm. We've been searching ever since. He reached into his back pocket and produced a folded document. I have his registration papers and ownership documents right here. The barn fell silent as Sheriff Davis examined the papers. They appeared official, complete with registration numbers and a description that matched Phoenix's appearance. Chestnut coat, approximately 16 hands high, with a distinctive white marking on the left front leg. "May I?" Richard asked, gesturing toward the horse. The sheriff glanced at Margaret, who nodded stiffly, though her hand didn't leave Phoenix's neck. Richard approached slowly, kneeling to examine the horse. He nodded with apparent recognition. "Yes, this is definitely Monarch," he said, using a name that landed like a stone in the quiet barn. "He's a valuable breeding stallion with an impressive bloodline. I'm grateful you've cared for him, but I'll be arranging transport to take him back to my facilities immediately." Margaret's face paled. "Monarch? This horse's name is Phoenix." Richard straightened, offering her a sympathetic but dismissive smile. "I understand you've formed an attachment, ma'am, but I assure you this is Monarch. I've owned him for 3 years now." "That's not possible," Margaret insisted, her voice gaining strength. "This horse has a distinctive heart-shaped marking that my husband and I recognized at birth. He disappeared during the flood of '97, 20 years ago." Richard's expression shifted to one of practiced patience. "With all due respect, Ms. Cooper." "Margaret Cooper." "Ms. Cooper, horses can have similar markings, and a horse missing for 20 years would be nearly 30 now. Well beyond the typical lifespan. The documentation clearly shows that Monarch is registered to Prescott Stables." He turned to Sheriff Davis. "I'd like to arrange transport as soon as possible. The horse needs professional care at our facilities." The atmosphere in the barn grew tense. Residents exchanged uneasy glances, torn between Margaret's certainty and the official-looking documentation Richard had presented. "Sheriff," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly, "Phoenix disappeared 20 years ago, but I would know him anywhere. This is my horse." Sheriff Davis studied both faces before him, Margaret's lined with conviction, Richard's smooth with confident authority. "Mr. Prescott, no one's disputing your paperwork, but given the circumstances, I think we should wait for our veterinarian to examine the horse. Dr. Reynolds will be here tomorrow morning. If this is indeed your animal, you'll want him properly assessed before transport anyway." Richard checked his expensive watch, obviously displeased but maintaining his composure. "Very well. I'll return tomorrow with a horse trailer and proper transportation equipment, but I want it noted that I've identified this animal as my property today." He handed a business card to the sheriff. "Call me when your vet has finished." As Richard drove away, the gathered townspeople erupted in conversation. "Those papers looked legitimate," Frank Miller noted. "But how could a horse from Lexington end up covered in oil in our river?" countered Jackson. "Prescott Stables is nearly 100 miles from here." Margaret sat back down on her stool, her hand never leaving Phoenix's neck. "It's him," she whispered, more to herself than the others. "I know it's him." Throughout the afternoon, the community rallied around Margaret. Eleanor brought family photo albums from her Historical Society collection, searching for pictures that might show Phoenix from 20 years ago. The Anderson boys, now in their 30s, remembered helping with Thomas Cooper's horses and tried to recall distinctive features. Even Frank Miller, initially skeptical, began questioning how a valuable show horse could travel so far and end up in such a condition. As evening approached, Phoenix showed more signs of improvement. He managed to stand for longer periods and drank water readily. His eyes, once dull with exhaustion, followed Margaret whenever she moved around the barn. "I wonder where he's been all these years," mused Eleanor, who had stayed to help Margaret. "Prepare a mixture of feed and medicine, and how he found his way back here to this exact spot. Margaret had been wondering the same thing. As darkness fell and most of the townspeople returned to their homes, promising to come back in the Yixum. Morning, she sat beside Phoenix, speaking to him softly. "Where have you been, old friend?" she whispered, stroking his mane. "What happened to you out there?" Sheriff Davis was the last to leave, pausing at the barn door. "Margaret, if you're right about this being Phoenix, we'll need proof. Something that contradicts those registration papers. Do you have any documentation from when you owned him?" Margaret's heart sank. After Thomas passed, she had cleared out most of their horse-related possessions, the memories too painful to preserve. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "There might be something in the attic. I'll have to look." "Do that," the sheriff advised, "and take pictures of that heart-shaped mark. We'll need all the evidence we can get." Left alone with Phoenix, Margaret settled onto her cot, her mind racing through 20 years of absence. If this truly was her Phoenix, where had he been all this time? How had he survived, and why return now, as if guided by some invisible thread connecting him to the past? As if sensing her thoughts, Phoenix nickered softly and stretched his neck. To rest his head near her cot, Margaret placed her hand on his muzzle, tears welling in her eyes. "If it really is you," she whispered, "I won't let you go again. I promise." Outside the barn, the Blackwater River continued its eternal journey, carrying secrets from upstream places unknown. In the moonlight, its surface shimmered like black oil, reflecting stars that had witnessed everything yet revealed. Nothing of the mystery that had washed ashore in Riverdale. In her cottage across town, Eleanor White sat surrounded by old newspaper clippings and historical society records, searching for anything that might help Margaret's case. One yellowed clipping from 1997 caught her attention, a small article about the flood that had devastated part of Riverdale. In the background of a photograph showing flood damage was a barely visible sign, Hartman Oil Company, private property. Eleanor circled it with a red pen, a chill running down her spine as connections began forming in her mind. Tomorrow would bring the veterinarian, Richard Prescott, with his transport trailer, and quite possibly answers that had been buried for decades along the banks of the Blackwater River. Dr. Sarah Reynolds arrived in Riverdale just as dawn broke, over the hills, driving directly to the Miller barn after a hasty call from Sheriff Davis. The veterinarian, a practical woman in her 40s who had served the county for over 15 years, was unprepared for the scene that greeted her. At least a dozen townspeople already gathered, Margaret Cooper asleep on a cot beside the mysterious horse, and an atmosphere charged with an anticipation unusual for the typically reserved community. "You'd think the circus had come to town," she remarked to Sheriff Davis as she unpacked her medical bag. "I've never seen half these folks get up before, 7 for anything less than a fire." "This is about more than just a horse," the sheriff replied quietly. "You'll see." Margaret woke as Dr. Reynolds approached, immediately straightening her rumpled clothes and brushing hair from her face. "Thank you for coming early, Sarah," she said, the familiarity of small-town relationships evident in her tone. Dr. Reynolds nodded, already focused on her patient. "Jack filled me in on the phone, but I need to hear it from you, Margaret. You believe this is Phoenix? The colt you lost during the flood?" "I know how it sounds," Margaret acknowledged, "but that heart-shaped mark isn't something you forget." The veterinarian nodded noncommittally and began her examination, working methodically as the gathered residents watched in silence. She checked the horse's eyes, teeth, respiratory rate, and the remaining patches of oil that still clung to portions of his coat. When she reached the left front leg with the distinctive marking, she paused, studying it with particular attention. "This mark is natural," she confirmed, "not branded or painted on, and I'd estimate this horse to be in his mid-20s based on his teeth and overall condition." A murmur of validation spread through the onlookers. "What about the oil?" Sheriff Davis asked. Any idea what kind it is or how long he's been covered in it? Dr. Reynolds frowned, rubbing a sample between her gloved fingers. It's crude oil, not refined. Given how it's penetrated his coat and affected his skin, I'd say he's been exposed to it repeatedly over time, not just from a single incident. Eleanor White stepped forward, clutching a folder of materials she'd collected overnight. I found something that might be relevant, she said, spreading several documents on a hay bale. These are records of the Hartman Oil Company that operated upstream until about 10 years ago. They had storage tanks along the river, and there were multiple reports of leakage over the years. Jackson Reed leaned in to examine the papers. My uncle worked there before they shut down. Said the whole operation was mismanaged, accidents waiting to happen. The property's been abandoned since they went bankrupt, added Frank Miller. County's been trying to get it cleaned up for years, but the ownership got tied up in legal battles. Dr. Reynolds continued her examination, but her expression had grown more thoughtful. This horse has been living rough for a long time. There's evidence of old injuries that healed without treatment, nutritional deficiencies, and exposure to the elements. But he's strong, a survivor. Could he have been living near that abandoned oil facility all this time? Margaret asked, hope evident in her voice. It's plausible, the veterinarian conceded. Horses can adapt to harsh conditions when necessary, and he might have found shelter in the old buildings while grazing on surrounding land. Before the conversation could continue, the sound of vehicles approaching drew everyone's attention. Through the barn door, they could see Richard Prescott's silver SUV pulling up, followed by a large horse trailer with Prescott Stables emblazoned on its side. Richard emerged in riding boots and a tailored jacket, accompanied by a younger man in similar attire. Is the veterinarian here? He called as he approached the barn. I've brought appropriate transportation and my stable manager to help with the move. Sheriff Davis stepped forward to intercept him. Dr. Reynolds is still completing her examination, Mr. Prescott. We'll need a bit more time. Richard's smile tightened. I've already delayed my schedule to accommodate this situation. Sheriff, my horse has received basic care, which I appreciate, but he needs proper treatment at my facilities. Dr. Reynolds emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on a towel. Mr. Prescott, I'm Dr. Sarah Reynolds, county veterinarian. I understand you believe this horse belongs to you. There's no belief about it, Richard replied smoothly, producing the same documentation he'd shown the day before. These papers clearly establish ownership. Monarch is a registered quarter horse with valuable bloodlines. The veterinarian examined the papers carefully. According to this, you purchased Monarch 3 years ago from Westfield Farms in Tennessee. That's correct. He's been part of our breeding program ever since, until he escaped during a storm this past summer. Dr. Reynolds frowned slightly. The horse in that barn shows signs of long-term neglect and environmental exposure, far longer than 3 months. His condition suggests years of living without proper care. Richard's stable manager, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. Horses can deteriorate quickly in the wild, especially if they've been accustomed to stable care. 3 months is plenty of time for significant decline. As the discussion continued outside, Margaret remained by Phoenix's side, stroking his neck and whispering reassurances. Eleanor joined her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Look at this, Eleanor said softly, showing Margaret a photograph she'd found in the Historical Society archives. The faded image showed Thomas Cooper standing proudly beside a young chestnut colt, the heart-shaped marking clearly visible on its left leg. This was in the Riverdale Gazette's coverage of the county fair in '94. The caption mentions Thomas Cooper's prize-winning colt, Phoenix. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she took the photograph. I remember this day. Thomas was so proud. She looked up at Eleanor with newfound determination. This proves Phoenix was ours. Outside, the conversation had grown more heated. With all due respect, Dr. Reynolds, while I value your opinion, I have legal documentation of ownership. Richard insisted. Unless someone can produce contradictory proof, I'll be taking Monarch back to my stables today. Actually, Eleanor interrupted, emerging from the barn with the photograph, we do have proof. She handed the picture to Sheriff Davis, who examined it before passing it to Richard. Richard studied the image with a frown. This proves nothing except that a similar-looking horse existed decades ago. Chestnut quarter horses with white markings aren't exactly rare. But heart-shaped markings in exactly that position are, countered Dr. Reynolds, who had retrieved her tablet from her truck and was scrolling through a database. I've just checked the quarter horse registry. There's no record of a Monarch. With your registration number being sold from Westfield Farms to Prescott Stables 3 years ago, the color drained from Richard's face, quickly replaced by an angry flush. This is absurd. My paperwork is in order. I demand you release my property immediately. Sheriff Davis stepped between them. Let's all take a breath here. Dr. Reynolds, are you suggesting there's an issue with Mr. Prescott's documentation? I'm saying the registration number doesn't match the transaction described, she replied carefully, which raises questions that should be resolved before any transfer of the animal takes place. The gathering had grown tense when a new vehicle approached, an old pickup truck with Hardin County Gazette painted on the door. A woman in her 30s jumped out, camera in hand. Caitlin James, Hardin County Gazette, she announced, approaching the group. I heard about the horse found covered in oil. Mind if I ask a few questions for a story I'm working on? Before Sheriff Davis could respond, Richard's stable manager grabbed his arm and whispered something urgently. Richard's expression darkened as he glanced at the reporter, then back at the gathered townspeople. This situation has gotten out of hand, he declared abruptly. I'll be returning with my attorney tomorrow. That horse is valuable breeding stock and rightfully belongs to Prescott Stables. With that, he signaled to his stable manager and they quickly returned to their vehicles, departing with a spray of gravel from the tires. Caitlin James watched them leave, then turned to the remaining group. Did I interrupt something important? Sheriff Davis sighed. You might say that. What exactly brings the Gazette all the way out here, Ms. James? The reporter's expression grew serious. I've been investigating the Hartman Oil Company for a series on environmental negligence in Kentucky. When I heard about a horse found covered in crude oil in Riverdale, it sounded connected. She glanced toward the barn. May I see him? Inside, Caitlin photographed Phoenix, while Margaret explained their belief that he was her long-lost horse. The reporter listened intently, taking notes. So Richard Prescott claims this is his horse, Monarch, that escaped 3 months ago, she summarized. But you believe it's actually Phoenix, who disappeared during the flood 20 years ago and somehow survived all this time. It sounds far-fetched, I know, Margaret admitted. Caitlin's expression shifted subtly. Actually, it sounds exactly like something Richard Prescott would do. The barn fell silent as everyone turned to her. What do you mean? Asked Sheriff Davis. Caitlin closed her notebook. Part of my investigation involves how Prescott acquired the old Hartman property through a shell company 5 years ago. He's been blocking cleanup efforts while pursuing permits to redevelop the land for an exclusive equestrian resort. But what does that have to do with Phoenix? Margaret asked. Prescott has a history of fraudulent documentation when it comes to horses with valuable bloodlines, Caitlin explained. I've been working with sources who claim he's been falsifying registration papers to inflate the value of his breeding stock. She gestured toward Phoenix. If this horse has a distinctive marking that makes him recognizable as part of a well-known local bloodline from the past, it would be valuable to someone like Prescott. Dr. Reynolds nodded. Slowly, the registration number discrepancy makes more sense now. Sheriff Davis frowned. Are you suggesting Prescott somehow found this horse and created false papers for him? I'm suggesting, Caitlin replied carefully, that the timing of his appearance is suspicious, and that Phoenix's return could potentially expose more than just horse registration fraud. As the implications of Caitlin's words sank in, Phoenix nickered softly and nudged Margaret's arm with his muzzle. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the barn door, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. The Blackwater River continued its steady flow beyond the fields, carrying with it fragments of a past that was gradually coming to light. "If what you're saying is true," Margaret said slowly, "then Phoenix might be the key to more than just his own story." Caitlin nodded, her expression grave. "There's something else you should know. Last week, county officials finally received approval to inspect the old Hartman property. They're scheduled to arrive next Monday, which might explain why Prescott is suddenly so desperate to resolve this situation quickly." Eleanor White, who had been quietly listening, suddenly straightened. "The flood of '97, she said, her voice tight with realization. "It wasn't just rain that caused the Blackwater to rise so dramatically. There was a report about a storage tank failure at Hartman that was buried in the news." The pieces were falling into place, connecting dots across 2 decades of history. Phoenix stood at the center of it all, a living testament to secrets that had been submerged beneath the surface of Riverdale's quiet existence. "What do we do now?" Frank Miller asked, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen over the barn. "Sheriff." Davis looked at each face in turn, his decision forming. "First, we protect this horse and gather every piece of evidence we can. Prescott will be back tomorrow with lawyers, and we need to be ready." As if understanding the gravity of the moment, Phoenix raised his head, meeting Margaret's gaze with eyes that seemed to hold 20 years of untold stories waiting to be revealed. The next morning dawned with a sense of purpose in Riverdale. What had begun as a simple rescue of an oil-covered horse had transformed into something much larger, a community united by compassion where indifference had once prevailed. In Margaret's cottage, the attic had been turned inside out. Boxes long untouched were now open, their contents spread across the living room floor. Margaret, Eleanor, and Judy had spent most of the night searching through decades of memories for anything that might prove Phoenix's identity. "I never thought I'd be grateful for Thomas's meticulous nature," Margaret said, carefully examining a leather-bound photo album. "He documented everything about our horses." Eleanor held up a stack of photographs she'd been organizing chronologically. "These track Phoenix from birth through age 5, right before he disappeared. The heart-shaped marking is clearly visible in most of them." Judy, who had been going through a box of old farm records, suddenly straightened. "Margaret, look at this." She held up a yellowed certificate with Phoenix's name and description, including specific mention of the heart-shaped marking. "His registration papers," Margaret whispered, taking the document with trembling hands. "Thomas always kept everything organized. I'd forgotten completely." At the Miller barn, activity had continued through the night. Dr. Reynolds had stayed, late, administering fluids and antibiotics to help Phoenix's recovery. Jackson Reed and several other young men from town had worked in shifts, reinforcing the barn's structure and creating a more comfortable recovery space. Frank Miller, whose initial skepticism had given way to fierce protectiveness, stood guard at the entrance, determined that no one would remove the horse without proper authorization. When Sheriff Davis arrived at dawn, he found at least 20 residents already gathered, sharing coffee and homemade breakfast foods as they discussed the day ahead. "Looks like we've got ourselves a community vigil," he remarked to Dr. Reynolds, who was checking Phoenix's vital signs. "More than that," she replied, "we've got a community remembering what it means to care collectively." By mid-morning, Caitlin James returned with additional information she'd gathered from her investigation. The reporter set up a makeshift workspace on a hay bale, spreading documents and photographs across it. "The old Hartman Oil Company property has been deteriorating for years," she explained to the gathered residents. According to county records, there were 7 reported spills between 1990 and its closure in 2014, but local environmental groups suspected many more went unreported. She pointed to aerial photographs showing storage tanks positioned dangerously close to the river. During the 97 flood, this tank was partially submerged. The company claimed no significant leakage occurred, but water samples taken downstream showed elevated contamination levels. Margaret, who had just arrived with her discovered documentation, studied the photographs with growing understanding. Phoenix disappeared right after that flood. We always assumed he'd been carried away by the current and she couldn't finish the sentence. But instead, he might have been swept upstream to the Hartman property, continued Eleanor, piecing the story together. Perhaps he found shelter there, surviving on whatever grazing was available around the abandoned facility, and repeatedly exposed to the leaking oil, added Dr. Reynolds. The pattern of oil residue on his coat suggests long-term contact, not a single incident. Sheriff Davis examined the registration papers Margaret had found. These clearly establish your ownership of Phoenix, Margaret, and they predate Prescott's documents by nearly 2 decades. There's more, Caitlin interjected, pulling out a folder marked with the Hartman Oil Company logo. A source provided me with internal memos showing the company was aware of ongoing leaks even after they officially closed. The land should have been designated for environmental cleanup years ago, but certain influential parties kept delaying the process. As the community digested this information, the sound of vehicles approaching drew everyone's attention. Richard Prescott had returned as promised, this time accompanied by not only his stable manager, but also a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit who was presumably his attorney. Sheriff Davis met them outside the barn, his stance protective. "Mr. Prescott, I assume this is your legal counsel?" James Whitfield, the suited man, introduced himself with practiced smoothness. "I understand there's a dispute regarding my client's property. We're here to resolve it expeditiously." "Actually," Sheriff Davis replied, "new evidence has emerged that contradicts your client's ownership claim." He gestured toward Margaret, who approached with her documentation. Richard barely glanced at the papers. "Sheriff, surely you don't expect decades-old documents to supersede modern registration papers. This is becoming absurd." "What's becoming clear," interrupted Caitlin, stepping forward with her press credentials visible, "is the pattern of deception surrounding both this horse and the Hartman property." Richard's face darkened as he recognized the reporter. "Ms. James, this is a private matter concerning livestock ownership, not an opportunity for your environmental crusading." "It seems they're connected," she replied evenly. "Just as the county's scheduled inspection of the Hartman property next week seems connected to your sudden interest in this particular horse." The attorney placed a restraining hand on Richard's arm as he began to respond angrily. After a whispered consultation, the attorney addressed the group with careful precision. "My client maintains his legitimate ownership of the horse called Monarch. However, in the interest of community relations, he might consider a reasonable financial settlement to resolve this matter amicably." Margaret stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. "This isn't about money, Mr. Whitfield. It never was. Everyone has a price, Ms. Cooper," Richard responded dismissively. "Not for this," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "Not for 20 years of wandering. Not for the truth." Dr. Reynolds, who had been observing the exchange, moved to stand beside Margaret. "From a veterinary perspective, this horse shows signs of long-term environmental exposure consistent with living near an industrial site, specifically an oil facility. His condition contradicts Mr. Prescott's claim that the animal escaped from a well-maintained stable just 3 months ago." The gathered townspeople murmured in agreement, forming a protective semicircle around the barn entrance. What had begun as one woman's recognition had evolved into a collective stance. "This is bordering on illegal detention of private property," the attorney warned. "We're prepared to seek an emergency court order if necessary." Sheriff Davis remained unmoved. "Law. You're welcome to try, Mr. Whitfield. In the meantime, I've contacted the State Agricultural Department and the Equine Registry Board to investigate the discrepancy in your client's documentation." As the confrontation intensified, Phoenix's soft nickering drew attention back to the barn's interior. The horse had managed to stand and was watching the gathered humans with alert eyes that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom. Despite the residual oil stains on his coat, his improved condition was remarkable, a testament to both his resilience and the community's care. Richard's confident facade finally cracked as he observed the united front before him. The residents of Riverdale, from elderly Margaret to young Jackson, from skeptical Frank to bookish Eleanor, stood together, transformed by their collective purpose. "This isn't over," Richard declared, gesturing for his attorney and stable manager to return to their vehicles. "Enjoy your moment of small-town solidarity while it lasts." As the expensive vehicles departed in a cloud of dust, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the gathered residents. But Margaret's expression remained serious as she watched them go. "He's right about one thing," she said quietly to Sheriff Davis. "This isn't over." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Prescott has political connections and financial resources. He won't give up easily, especially if there's more at stake than just a horse." Caitlin, who had been making notes throughout the confrontation, approached them. "You're both right, which is why the story needs to be told, fully and publicly. The horse that found his way home after 20 years is compelling enough, but when you connect it to corporate negligence and environmental cover-up, it becomes impossible to ignore." Throughout the remainder of the day, Phoenix continued to improve. Now able to walk around the makeshift paddock the townspeople had constructed beside the barn, Margaret rarely left his side, often speaking to him in soft tones about Thomas, about their life together on the small ranch, about the years that had passed in his absence. As evening approached, Caitlin prepared to return to her office to write her story, promising to share a draft with Margaret before publication. The town had organized a rotation schedule to ensure Phoenix was never left unattended, with volunteers signing up for shifts throughout the night. Before leaving, Caitlin pulled Margaret aside. "There's something else you should know," she said, quietly. "My source indicated that soil and water testing at the Hartman property could potentially reveal contamination levels that would require extensive remediation, possibly millions of dollars worth. If Prescott knew about this when he acquired the land through his shell company, he'd have a powerful motive to prevent the inspection," Margaret finished, understanding the larger implications. "And Phoenix, with his oil-covered coat and his connection to the property, could expose everything." Caitlin nodded. "Tomorrow's paper will run my initial story focusing on Phoenix's remarkable return. But the environmental investigation will take longer to substantiate." As stars appeared above Riverdale that night, Margaret sat on a wooden chair outside the barn, watching Phoenix graze peacefully in the paddock. The horse that had once been given up for lost had somehow found his way back, not just to her, but to a purpose larger than either of them could have imagined. Eleanor joined her, offering a warm cup of tea. "You know what strikes me most about all this?" she said, settling beside Margaret. "It's not just that Phoenix survived all these years. It's that when he finally returned, covered in the evidence of what he'd endured, it wasn't enough for one person to recognize him. It took all of us working together to protect him and uncover the truth." Margaret smiled, thinking about how a single afternoon had transformed not just her isolated existence, but the connections between neighbors who had lived alongside one another for years without truly seeing each other. Thomas used to say that horses remember their way. A home, no matter how far they wander, she said softly. "But sometimes home isn't a place. It's the people who recognize you for who you really are, beneath whatever covers you." As if understanding her words, Phoenix raised his head from grazing, his eyes reflecting the rising moon, his heart-shaped marking visible even in the gentle darkness that had settled over Riverdale. The Hardin County Gazette's morning edition carried the headline, "Miracle at Riverdale, Horse Returns After 20 Years," accompanied by Caitlin's photographs of Phoenix and Margaret. By noon, the story had been picked up by larger papers in Lexington and Louisville, and television crews from regional stations began arriving in the previously overlooked town. Riverdale, accustomed to existing in quiet anonymity, suddenly found itself at the center of public attention. "I never expected this," Margaret confessed to Eleanor as they watched a news van park near the Miller barn. "I just wanted to help a suffering animal." "That's why it's resonating with people," Eleanor replied. One act of compassion revealed something much bigger than any of us anticipated. Sheriff Davis had established an orderly system for managing the newfound attention, designating Frank Miller as the unofficial spokesperson who would determine which reporters could approach the barn. The community had seamlessly organized itself, with residents bringing food for the volunteers, children creating handmade "Welcome Home Phoenix" signs, and several local businesses donating supplies for the horse's continued recovery. Dr. Reynolds, who had been monitoring Phoenix closely, expressed amazement at his progress. "His resilience is remarkable," she told Margaret as they watched him trot around the paddock, his movements growing stronger each day. "The toxins are clearing from his system, and his coat is regaining its natural sheen where the oil has been removed." By mid-afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived. An elderly man with weathered features who introduced himself as Harold Blackburn, former stable manager at the old Westfield Farms in Tennessee. "I read the story online," he explained to Sheriff Davis. "Something about it didn't sit right with me. I worked at Westfield for 30 years before retiring, and I know for a fact we never sold a stallion to Richard Prescott 3 years ago." Sheriff Davis quickly brought Harold to meet Margaret and Phoenix. The elderly horseman examined the animal carefully, paying particular attention to the heart-shaped marking. "I've seen thousands of horses in my lifetime," Harold said finally, "but markings like this are 1 in a million. I can't say for certain. This is your Phoenix, ma'am, but I can tell you definitively this is not a horse that came from Westfield Farms. And I'm willing to sign an affidavit stating that the sale documentation is fraudulent." As word of Harold's testimony spread, the story grew more complex. By evening, a local environmental group had organized a peaceful demonstration at the county courthouse demanding immediate inspection of the Hartman property. Caitlin's continuing investigation had uncovered connections between Prescott's development company and several county officials who had repeatedly delayed cleanup efforts. That night, as Margaret sat with Phoenix under a sky filled with stars, she reflected on the transformation that had overtaken her life in just a few days. Her isolation had been replaced by constant interaction, her quiet routine disrupted by perpetual activity, and her long-dormant sense of purpose reignited by circumstances she could never have anticipated. "I think Thomas would be proud," she told Phoenix, stroking his now gleaming neck. "Not just of you for surviving, but of what your return has set in motion." The horse nudged her gently, his eyes reflecting a trust that seemed impossible given the hardships he had endured. Whatever trauma he had experienced during those missing years had not destroyed his capacity to reconnect, a resilience that Margaret found both inspiring and humbling. As dawn broke the next day, Sheriff Davis arrived at the barn with unexpected news. "The county administrator called an emergency meeting last night," he told the gathered volunteers. "They've moved up the inspection of the Hartman property to today in light of the public interest in the situation." Margaret exchanged meaningful glances with Eleanor and Caitlin. "That's either very good or very concerning," Eleanor remarked. "It means we need to be there," Caitlin said firmly, "to document whatever they find or don't find." Within an hour, a convoy of vehicles had formed, ready to follow the county inspection team to the abandoned Hartman property. Margaret hesitated, reluctant to leave Phoenix, but Dr. Reynolds reassured her. "He's stable now, and we have plenty of volunteers to watch over him. This might be your chance to finally understand what happened all those years ago." The drive to the Hartman property took them upstream along the Blackwater River, through landscapes that grew increasingly industrialized and then neglected. When they finally reached the chain-link fence surrounding the facility, Margaret was struck by the eerie desolation of the place. Rusted equipment, crumbling infrastructure, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. County inspectors in protective gear were already taking soil and water samples, while environmental officials documented the condition of several massive storage tanks positioned dangerously close to the riverbank. Sheriff Davis used his authority to allow Margaret, Eleanor, and Caitlin to observe from a safe distance. Those tanks were supposed to have been emptied and properly sealed when the company shut down, one inspector explained when Caitlin questioned him, but it appears that process was never completed. As they surveyed the property, Margaret noticed something unexpected. A small, partially collapsed outbuilding near the river's edge, with what appeared to be makeshift pathways worn into the surrounding vegetation. "What's that structure?" she asked one of the officials. "Old storage shed, according to the blueprints, nothing significant." But Margaret felt drawn to it, moving carefully across the uneven ground despite warnings to stay with the group. As she approached the dilapidated building, she noticed clumps of hair caught on the splintered wood of the doorframe, hair that matched Phoenix's chestnut coat. "Sheriff," she called, her voice tight with emotion. "I think I've found where he was living." Inside the crumbling structure, the evidence was unmistakable. A depression in the ground where a large animal had repeatedly rested, remnants of grasses and weeds that had clearly been pulled from outside and brought in. Most telling were the marks along the lower walls, rub marks at precisely the height of a horse's shoulders, where Phoenix would have pressed against the structure for shelter. "He survived here," Margaret whispered, tears filling her eyes as she pieced together the reality of what must have happened. The flood must have carried him upstream to this place, and somehow he adapted, found shelter, survived. Sheriff Davis examined the shed carefully. The doorframe is broken in a way that would allow an animal to come and go. And look, there's access to the river just beyond those trees. He would have had water, grazing in the surrounding fields, and this shelter. But why leave now? After all these years, Eleanor wondered aloud. The answer came from one of the environmental inspectors who had overheard their conversation. "The river level dropped significantly during the drought this summer," he explained. "Lower than it's been in decades. That might have created a pathway that wasn't there before, allowing the horse to follow the river downstream." "Back to Riverdale," Margaret finished. "Back home." As the inspection continued throughout the day, the evidence mounted. Not just of Phoenix's improbable survival, but of environmental negligence on a scale that couldn't be ignored or covered up. Tests revealed crude oil contamination in both soil and water that far exceeded permissible levels, suggesting years of unreported leakage. By late afternoon, county officials had no choice but to designate the site for immediate remediation, and to open an investigation into how the property had changed hands without proper environmental assessment. Richard Prescott's development plans were officially suspended pending the investigation's outcome. When the news reached Riverdale, the town erupted in celebration, not just for the environmental victory, but for the vindication of their collective action. What had begun with one woman's refusal to turn away from suffering had catalyzed a community's rediscovery of its voice and power. 3 days later, a different kind of gathering took place at Margaret's cottage. The small, previously neglected backyard had been transformed by volunteers into a suitable paddock for Phoenix, complete with a newly constructed stable that somehow managed to incorporate salvaged wood from Thomas's original barn. "We figured, he should be home with you," Frank Miller explained, as he and Jackson showed Margaret the finishing touches they'd added. "The Miller barn was just temporary housing until we could get this ready." As Phoenix was led onto Margaret's property, for the first time in 20 years, a sense of completion hung in the air. The horse explored his new surroundings with curious interest, occasionally stopping to nuzzle Margaret as if to reassure her that he approved. "I still can't believe any of this happened," she confessed to Eleanor as they watched Phoenix from the porch. "If you'd told me a week ago that Phoenix would return, that the town would come together, like this, that we'd expose a cover-up, I would have said you were reading too many novels." Eleanor smiled, placing her hand over Margaret's. "The most extraordinary stories are often the true ones. And speaking of stories, have you seen today's paper?" She handed Margaret the Hardin County Gazette, open to a feature spread written by Caitlin. The headline read, "The Heart of Recovery, How One Horse Inspired a Town to Heal." The article chronicled not just Phoenix's improbable journey and the environmental implications of his discovery, but the transformation of Riverdale itself, from a place of disconnected individuals to a community united by purpose. Accompanying photographs showed townspeople working together at the Miller barn, Phoenix regaining his strength, and the newly formed Riverdale Animal Rescue Committee that had already begun taking in other abandoned animals. "Caitlin certainly has a way with words," Margaret remarked, touched by the comprehensiveness of the story. "She's not the only one making an impact," Eleanor replied. "The county council called this morning. They want to discuss establishing a permanent greenbelt along our section of the river, and they specifically asked for your input." Margaret looked surprised. "Me? I don't know anything about environmental planning." "You know about commitment," Eleanor said simply. "About not turning away when something matters. That's what they need right now." As evening settled over Riverdale, Margaret sat on her porch swing, watching Phoenix graze contentedly in his new paddock. The setting sun painted the landscape in gold and amber, transforming the ordinary scene into something precious. Sheriff Davis stopped by, bringing reports from the ongoing investigation. "Prescott's attorneys are negotiating a settlement," he informed her. "He's facing charges for document fraud and potential environmental violations, but he's trying to minimize the damage to his reputation." "And the Hartman property?" Margaret asked. "Going to require extensive cleanup," the sheriff replied. "But the county's committed to restoring it properly this time. There's even talk of eventually turning part of it into a nature preserve." As he left, Margaret returned her attention to Phoenix, who had approached the fence nearest the porch. In the fading light, his coat gleamed with a richness that oil and neglect had temporarily obscured, but never truly destroyed. The heart-shaped marking on his leg seemed to pulse with life, a symbol of identity that had remained constant through all the years of separation. She thought about the journey that had brought them both to this moment, the losses they had endured, the obstacles they had overcome, and the unexpected beauty that had emerged from their reunion. Phoenix had traveled an impossible path to find his way back, carrying with him evidence that would heal not just his own wounds, but the wounds of a community and a landscape. Margaret had once believed that grief was something to be endured in solitude, that connections were luxuries she could no longer afford after Thomas's passing. But Phoenix's return had shown her that the most profound recovery happened not in isolation, but in the shared spaces between individual lives. The horse had not merely come home, he had helped create a new definition of home for everyone involved. In the days and weeks that followed, Riverdale continued its transformation. The impromptu gathering at the Miller Barn evolved into regular community meetings. The volunteer roster for animal rescue expanded to include rehabilitation programs for troubled youth. Eleanor established an oral history project to document the town's relationship with the river across generations. And every morning, Margaret woke to the soft nickering of Phoenix outside her window, a sound she had never expected to hear again. A daily reminder that some bonds transcend separation and suffering to find their way back to where they truly belong. What had begun as a disturbing disruption to Riverdale's tranquil existence, a dark shape on the riverbank, an animal covered in the evidence of human negligence, had become the catalyst for renewal. Phoenix's journey from abandonment to recognition had inspired a parallel journey in the community itself, washing away the indifference that had accumulated over the years, like a layer of oil over their collective conscience. One afternoon, as volunteers gathered at Margaret's cottage to help construct additional paddocks for newly rescued animals, a stranger arrived, an elderly man who identified himself as Robert Thornton, a rancher from a neighboring county. "I read about your horse in the paper," he explained to Margaret. "The marking caught my attention. You see, 20 years ago, I bought a mare from a breeder who mentioned she came from the Cooper bloodline, known for a distinctive heart-shaped, a mark." Margaret's breath caught. "Phoenix's bloodline continued?" Robert nodded. "The mare had a foal with that same marking. I've bred several generations since then, each carrying that unique heart shape. I thought you might want to know that Phoenix's legacy lived on, even when you thought it was lost." As Robert showed Margaret photographs of horses descended from Phoenix's bloodline, she was struck by the perfect symmetry of it all. How what seemed like an ending had actually been a continuation, how loss had secretly harbored preservation all along. The story of the oil-covered horse who found his way home spread far beyond Riverdale, touching people across the state and eventually the country. It wasn't just the improbability of Phoenix's survival or the environmental implications of his discovery that captured hearts. It was the simple, powerful message at the core of the story that a single act of compassion could illuminate a path forward when all other lights had gone out. For Margaret Cooper, who had once believed her life's meaningful chapters were behind her, each day now opened with possibility. Phoenix's return had not erased her losses or reversed time's passage, but it had revealed how the present could still be transformed by courage, by community, and by the decision to kneel down and act when others turned away. And every evening, as she watched the sun set over the paddock where Phoenix grazed contentedly, she whispered the same words, not just to the horse who had defied impossible odds to find his way back, but to herself and the community that had been reborn through his return. Welcome home. And dear listeners, we hope Margaret and Phoenix's journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. The story of one woman's compassion and a horse's remarkable return reminds us that true connection can overcome even the greatest obstacles. For more emotionally resonant stories like this one, we've created a special playlist that explores the power of recognition and healing. You'll find it by clicking to your left. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique narratives that illuminate the complexity and beauty of life's unexpected turns. What moment in Margaret and Phoenix's story resonated most with you? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.